The sound of boots echoed in the corridor, slow, deliberate, and heavy. The kind of footsteps that made everyone hold their breath. In the dim light of the infirmary, Nurse Aiko Tanaka knelt beside a small metal door. Her hands trembled as she slid a bowl of rice through the narrow slot, the grains still steaming in the cold night air. On the other side of that door was an American prisoner, fevered, skeletal, barely breathing. He whispered something she didn't understand, but when he lifted his head and forced a weak smile, she realized he had said, "Thank you." Outside, the wind carried the sound of distant artillery, Japan's empire crumbling piece by piece. Yet inside this concrete cell, the war had already ended for one brief moment, replaced by something far more dangerous than bullets: compassion. She froze as a flashlight beam swept across the hallway. Her heart pounded so loudly, she feared it might betray her. If anyone saw what she was doing, she'd be executed. No trial, no mercy. Still, she didn't move. The soldier's breathing steadied. The rice was gone. And in that fragile silence, Aiko realized she wasn't feeding an enemy. She was feeding what was left of her own humanity. But what no one knew yet was how far she would go. When Aiko Tanaka first arrived at the POW camp, the air itself felt poisoned. A thick metallic stench of sweat, medicine, and hopelessness. She had been a nurse in a civilian hospital before the war, tending to farmers, mothers, and children. But here the rules were different. Here, mercy was treason. The first thing she saw were rows of men behind barbed wire. American, British, Australian, reduced to shapes and rags. A guard shouted, "Do not look them in the eyes." She obeyed until she didn't. One afternoon, while passing the infirmary, she heard a groan. Low, human, and far too familiar. Inside lay a man with a bandaged leg blackened by infection. His lips were cracked, his water bowl empty. Her instinct took over. She poured from her own canteen, the guard outside unaware. The man met her gaze and whispered, "Arigato." His accent was broken, but his sincerity wasn't. That night, as Aiko scrubbed the blood from her hands, she realized something unsettling. She had spent her whole life believing the enemy was faceless, but now the face had eyes, and they looked just like hers. Would she turn away, or would she cross that invisible line again? The infirmary reeked of iodine, rot, and something worse: burnt flesh. Aiko moved between the cots, her mask damp with sweat. On one side lay Japanese soldiers, their wounds carefully wrapped, morphine ready on the tray. On the other, the enemy prisoners, silent, trembling, forgotten. The difference wasn't skill. It was permission. She wasn't allowed to save them. A sergeant barked orders to ignore the foreigners, to let nature finish what the war started. But when he left, the room grew heavy with another kind of command: conscience. Aiko knelt beside a prisoner whose leg was gangrenous. The flies came before the painkillers did. She pulled the curtain shut, tore open a bandage meant for a Japanese soldier, and whispered, "Hold still." The man bit his lip until blood ran down his chin, but didn't cry out. As she cleaned the wound, the burnt smell clung to her skin. It would stay there for weeks, a scent that no soap could wash away, a memory that no victory could justify. When she left the room, she caught her reflection in a cracked mirror. For a moment, she didn't look like a nurse of the empire. She looked like a woman slowly becoming a traitor, one bandage at a time. But that was only the beginning. The rumor spread quickly. The nurse talks to the Americans. It began as a whisper in the mess hall, then grew into accusation. That morning, Aiko was summoned to the command office. The smell of tobacco hung thick in the air. Her superior, Captain Mori, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply placed her confiscated notebook on the table. Pages filled with sketches of bandaged hands, quiet faces, and words she had written to remember them. He lifted his eyes. "You've forgotten who the enemy is?" Aiko tried to speak, but the back of his hand came faster than her words. The slap rang louder than the cicadas outside. "Compassion," he hissed, "is a disease, and I will not have it spread in my camp." She left the room numb, the taste of blood at the corner of her mouth. Outside, the sky was brutally blue, the kind of blue that mocked the pain it looked down upon. She walked past the barbed wire and saw one of the POWs looking up at her, the same man whose wound she had cleaned. He smiled faintly, as if unaware she had just been punished because of him. That night, as she washed the dried blood from her fingers, she whispered, "I'm not the one who's sick." And yet, for the first time, she realized something terrifying. She now feared her own country more than its enemies. But there was still one thing she hadn't lost: the courage to disobey again. Rain had turned the camp yard into a swamp. The prisoners stood barefoot in the mud, hauling crates under the watchful eyes of guards. Aiko was sent to inspect the infirmary after the storm, her shoes sinking into the wet ground with every step. Inside one of the barracks, she noticed a torn notebook half buried beneath a cot. Out of habit, she picked it up, wiping away the grime. Inside were sketches, rough, smudged, but hauntingly beautiful. A child with pigtails flying a kite, a woman hanging laundry under a bright sun, a small house with a picket fence and flowers. She turned the page expecting the next drawing to show an American flag. Instead, it was Mount Fuji. Her breath caught. For a moment, she thought it must belong to a Japanese soldier, but the handwriting was in English. Beneath the drawing were 4 words: "Home looks the same everywhere." She sat there, unable to move, staring at the paper until her vision blurred. The war had taught her that the enemy was different, inhuman, monstrous. But here, in a notebook soaked with rain and mud, she found something that shattered that illusion: a mirror. When she returned the sketchbook to its owner, the young prisoner bowed his head. No words, just gratitude. That night, Aiko lay awake listening to the thunder roll across the island. For the first time, she wondered if her country's greatest weapon wasn't its army, but its lies. And soon, she would see just how deep those lies went. The camp gathered that afternoon for a propaganda briefing. Officers stood beneath a tattered flag, their voices echoing across the courtyard. "The Americans are savages," they declared. "They eat like beasts, fight without honor, and show no mercy." Aiko stood among the nurses, her hands clasped, her face still and obedient. But inside, something was cracking. She had seen the opposite with her own eyes. A prisoner sharing his bread, another helping a comrade to walk, though he could barely stand himself. When the speech ended, the guards tossed buckets of leftover broth toward the prisoners. A few men dove for it. One man didn't. He tore a piece of bread from his ration and gave it to another who had fainted. Aiko froze. The guards laughed. "Even their weak feed their weak," one said. But she didn't laugh, because in that moment, she realized something chilling. The kindness she had been taught to despise was the one thing keeping these men alive. That night, she stared at the framed portrait of the emperor above her bunk, lit faintly by a flickering oil lamp. For years she had prayed to that face, believing it represented purity and honor. But now, beneath the light, it seemed hollow, a mask made of silence and fear. She whispered, almost to herself, "If mercy is treason, then maybe treason is all that's left of mercy." She didn't know it yet, but that thought would become the line she could never uncross. It began with a single handful of rice, nothing more. That night, after lights out, the camp lay under a thin blanket of rain. The guards drank and shouted near the mess hall, their laughter mixing with the thunder. Aiko waited until the noise swallowed her footsteps, then slipped into the kitchen. The dog's food sat in metal bowls, white rice, better than anything the prisoners had eaten in weeks. Her hands shook as she scooped some into a tin. Every sound felt like a gun cocking, the rattle of the ladle, the whisper of the wind. She hid the tin under her apron and moved toward the infirmary. Inside, the air was damp and sour. A single prisoner was awake, his ribs visible beneath his skin. When he saw her, his eyes widened in disbelief. She placed the tin beside him and pressed a finger to her lips. He nodded once, then began to eat. Slowly, reverently, as if the rice were a prayer. Aiko didn't stay to watch. She turned away, heart hammering, aware that if anyone found out, the punishment would be swift and final. But outside the door, she paused. Through the crack, she saw him divide the rice in half and pass the rest to the man beside him. In that instant, she understood something the war had tried to erase. Compassion multiplies even in captivity. When the rain stopped, she stepped out beneath the cold moonlight, her uniform damp, her soul trembling. She whispered, "Just one more night, then I'll stop." But of course she wouldn't. By the third night, they were waiting for her, not with words, but with silence. As Aiko approached the infirmary, faint eyes glimmered through the shadows, cautious but hopeful. She slipped the small bundle of rice through the gap again, and this time a hand brushed hers. It was rough, calloused, yet gentle. The next evening, someone had left something for her in return. A tiny carving, shaped from a toothbrush handle. A cross, its edges smoothed by hours of secret work. She turned it in her palm under the dim lantern light, and for the first time since the war began, her chest ached with something she thought she'd forgotten: tenderness. She hid the cross inside her uniform, close to her heart, but the missing rations didn't go unnoticed. The cook began counting portions. Guards whispered that a thief was among them. Aiko avoided their eyes, pretending to focus on her duties. Yet each night, she returned to that door, her steps measured, her breathing shallow. Every act of mercy felt heavier, every heartbeat louder. One evening, she found a note scrawled on a scrap of bandage. "You kept us alive when the world forgot we were human." She folded it carefully, pressing it against her chest, as if to hide it from the world. For a moment, she forgot which side of the barbed wire she was on, but compassion had a sound, and soon it would echo farther than she ever intended. By early spring, the island camp changed its rhythm. Orders came down from Tokyo. The imperial inspectors were coming. Everything had to look honorable. Every prisoner well-treated. Every nurse loyal. The guards cleaned the yard, patched uniforms with stolen fabric, even painted over rust with mud to make it look like fresh metal. Aiko was ordered to prepare the infirmary, to make the prisoners presentable. She stood by their beds, rewrapping wounds she had secretly treated for months. Her forbidden kindness, the very thing that could have killed her, was now being used as propaganda. "Make them look healthy," her superior barked. "The Empire shows mercy." Aiko nodded, but inside, she felt sick. Mercy wasn't something to display. It was something you did when no one was watching. One prisoner, the young Marine she'd fed, met her gaze and smiled faintly as she tied his bandage tighter. His lips moved silently. "Don't let them break you." That afternoon, the inspectors arrived. Stiff uniforms, polished boots, eyes like ice. They walked past the rows of POWs, nodding with manufactured pride. One paused near the infirmary door. "These foreigners look strong," he said. "Discipline works." Aiko's hands tightened on her clipboard to stop them from shaking. As the convoy left, the guards laughed, relieved. The deception had worked. But Aiko knew something none of them did. The inspection had changed nothing. The prisoners would still starve tomorrow, and she would still feed them. What she didn't know yet was that someone had seen her. The night was thick with humidity and fear. Someone had stolen salt from the officers' pantry, a handful at most, but in wartime Japan, that was enough to cost a man his life. At dawn, the siren wailed through the camp. The prisoners were dragged into the courtyard, barefoot in the mud. The commandant shouted, "A thief among them will confess, or they will all suffer." No one spoke. Then they found it, a pouch of salt hidden beneath a sleeping mat. The man they pulled forward was gaunt, trembling, his face familiar. It was the same Marine Aiko had been secretly feeding. He didn't resist, didn't beg, just looked at her. One silent glance that said, "Don't move." They tied him to a post and made the others watch. The punishment was swift, efficient, rehearsed. The gunshot cracked across the yard like thunder. The birds didn't even stir. Aiko's knees went weak. She wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. Later, as she washed the blood from the floor, she saw the salt stains scattered across the boards, tiny white flecks glowing in the lamplight like fallen stars. That night she almost burned her diary. Instead, she wrote, "Mercy is not weakness. It is rebellion." She closed the book and pressed it to her chest until her hands stopped shaking. Outside, the guards were laughing, passing around a flask. Inside, a nurse sat in the dark, vowing that if the Empire demanded cruelty, she would commit treason again and again. And soon, the earth itself would conspire to give her another chance. It happened just before sunrise. The ground began to hum, a low, animal growl rising from beneath the island itself. Then came the roar. The barracks swayed, dishes shattered, and a chorus of shouts broke the dawn. Aiko threw herself against the doorway as the infirmary ceiling cracked open. Dust rained down like ash. The guards scattered, some praying, some screaming. Outside, the watchtower crumbled into the jungle, and the barbed wire fences twisted like serpents. When the shaking stopped, the camp was chaos. Half the kitchen buried, the storage shed collapsed. For a brief trembling hour, the war seemed to vanish. It was just humans digging other humans out of the rubble. Aiko ran to the infirmary. The prisoners were covered in dust, blood, and fear. One of them, the young Marine's friend, was pinned beneath a beam. Without thinking, she grabbed a crowbar, joined the prisoners, and together they lifted the wood until his body slid free. Their hands touched, hers trembling, his blistered and rough. He looked at her and said softly, "Arigato." A guard shouted, "Get away from him." But the officer didn't punish her. He was too busy staring at the wreckage of his barracks, muttering that the gods were angry. By nightfall, the camp lay silent under a bruised sky. The prisoners had been fed extra rations, not out of kindness, but because the earthquake had spared the supply shed. Aiko walked through the ruins, her lantern flickering. She realized something strange. When the earth had split open, the world had shown its truth. No empire, no orders, no enemies. Just people, fragile and mortal, standing on shaking ground. But fate wasn't done yet. The next morning, a package from Tokyo would arrive, one that would test her in ways even the earthquake couldn't. The supply plane came 2 days after the quake, silver wings glinting against a washed-out sky. The soldiers cheered as it circled and dropped its cargo by parachute. To them, it meant survival. To Aiko, it meant temptation. The crates were marked Tokyo Medical Division. Inside, morphine, bandages, canned food, and something no one had seen in years: chocolate. Real chocolate. The officers tore into the boxes first, laughing like children. The guards pocketed cigarettes and tins of meat. The prisoners, of course, received nothing. Aiko was ordered to inventory the medical supplies. As she tallied morphine vials and scalpels, her eyes stopped on a single wrapped chocolate bar wedged between gauze rolls. American brand. Irony, she thought. The enemy feeds us now. That night, while the others drank and celebrated the Emperor's mercy, she slipped the bar into her uniform pocket. Her heart beat so loudly, it drowned out the cicadas. In the infirmary, one prisoner lay pale and shaking. Fever from a wound that wouldn't close. The same man who had once carved her that little cross. She placed the chocolate beside him, wordless. His eyes widened, disbelieving. He touched the wrapper like it was silk, whispering, "Home." Aiko turned away before he could thank her. Outside, she leaned against the wall, her breath unsteady. She had risked everything for something so small, yet she felt lighter than she had in months. The next morning, a commotion broke out. Someone had noticed a missing chocolate bar. The cook blamed a prisoner, the guards prepared punishment, and Aiko said nothing. As the accused was dragged away, she stared at her blood-stained hands and thought, maybe sin and salvation look the same when you're starving. But her silence would soon have a cost. One that arrived not in a crate, but in a letter. The letter was never meant for anyone else's eyes. She wrote it late one night when the rain whispered against the tin roof and the guards had finally stopped shouting. Her candle burned low, the flame flickering each time her hand trembled. "Mother," she wrote, "I no longer understand what honor means. They say mercy is weakness, but when I see their faces, those starving men, I feel closer to God than I ever did praying in uniform." She folded the paper carefully, sealing it with a piece of thread from her sleeve. In the morning, she handed it to the courier plane's clerk, a young conscript who promised to post it on his next run to Tokyo. But the letter never left the island. 2 weeks later, Captain Mori summoned her again. The letter sat open on his desk, the paper damp with sweat and spilled tea. His voice was calm, almost kind. "You think the Emperor will forgive this?" he asked. "You shame your nation and your bloodline." He tore the letter in half, then in half again, until it was nothing but scraps scattered across the floor like fallen snow. "From today," he said, "you will no longer treat prisoners. You will clean latrines. You will forget what you've written." Aiko bowed her head, not in obedience, but to hide the tears. As she left, one of the guards sneered, "The nurse with the traitor's heart." That night, she found one fragment of her letter under the cot. Just 5 words remained. "I will not stop caring." She tucked it into her shoe and whispered, "Then let them call me traitor." By dawn, she was reassigned to the isolation wing, the place where the dying were sent to be forgotten. But someone she'd never met was waiting for her there, and he would change everything. He arrived on a stretcher, a skeleton wrapped in a soldier's uniform, barely 19. Blonde hair matted with blood, one arm twisted under his ribs. The guards dumped him on the floor like cargo, muttering that he wouldn't last the night. Aiko knelt beside him, pressing her fingers to his throat. A pulse. Faint, but there. "What's his name?" she asked. The answer came in a scoff. "Does it matter?" When they left, she pulled a blanket over him, whispering softly, though he couldn't hear, "You matter." For days she fed him broth through cracked lips, kept the flies away, and changed his bandages in secret. He spoke little, only fragments between fevered dreams. Iowa, mother, baseball. The words felt alien, yet painfully familiar. Pieces of a life she could almost imagine. On the 5th night, he woke to the sound of her humming an old Japanese lullaby. His eyes fluttered open, blue and bewildered. Why are you doing this?" Aiko hesitated, searching for the truth. "Because," she whispered, "I can't not." He smiled weakly. "You're not like the others." Her voice broke as she replied, "I used to be." The next morning, she was ordered to prepare him for transfer. He'd recovered enough to be moved back to the main barracks. As she buttoned his shirt, he slipped something into her hand, a small torn piece of his dog tag. "So you'll remember," he said. She wanted to tell him she didn't need a token, that she'd remember his eyes long after the war was dust. But before she could speak, the guards came. As they dragged him away, he turned and mouthed a single word. "Live." That night, Aiko sat in the dark, the broken tag in her palm, and realized every act of compassion had brought her closer to the line. And now, there was no going back. The next dawn, the Emperor's inspectors returned. This time they weren't here to praise. They were here to judge. The morning of the inspection smelled of rain and fear. Soldiers rushed about polishing boots, painting over rust, even raking the mud to make it look like solid ground. Aiko's orders were simple. Stand straight, speak little, and let the foreigners look alive. The prisoners were lined up in rows, uniforms patched, wounds hidden beneath fresh bandages. Their ribs still showed, but their faces were clean. The deception was almost beautiful, a theater of mercy, rehearsed by cruelty. A convoy of black cars rolled through the gate. The imperial officers stepped out, pressed uniforms, white gloves, faces carved from stone. Captain Mori greeted them with a bow so deep it looked like submission. Aiko stood behind him, silent, her hands trembling against the clipboard. One of the inspectors stopped near the infirmary. "These prisoners," he said, "they seem strong." His tone was suspicion, not praise. "What medicine do you use?" Aiko's pulse quickened. She opened her mouth, then felt Mori's gaze like a blade at her throat. "The Empire's discipline," he replied smoothly, "and the mercy of His Majesty." But then, something unexpected happened. The young Marine, the boy from Iowa, stepped forward. His voice was hoarse but clear. "She saved us," he said in broken Japanese. "The nurse. She fed us. She kept us alive." The courtyard froze. The guards looked at one another, uncertain whether to strike him or salute him. Aiko's heart stopped. Captain Mori's expression didn't change. He simply said, "Remove him." Two soldiers dragged the boy away. The inspectors turned and continued their tour, their shoes clicking against the wooden boards, the sound of bureaucracy over compassion. When they left, Aiko was called into Mori's office. He didn't shout. He simply wrote 2 words on a paper slip and handed it to her. Transfer order. She was to leave the camp at dawn. That night, she packed in silence. But before leaving, she prepared one final act, something the prisoners would never forget. The rain came again that night, soft and cold, the kind that made the lanterns flicker like fading souls. Aiko knew she would be gone by sunrise. The paper in her pocket said transfer, but everyone knew what that meant. Reassignment was just another word for disappearance. Still, she couldn't leave without saying goodbye. She crept into the kitchen after midnight. The shelves were nearly bare, yet she gathered what she could. Handfuls of rice, a few drops of soy sauce, dried seaweed. Her fingers moved quickly, shaping each rice ball with trembling care. 24 of them, one for each man still alive in the infirmary. When she entered the ward, they were awake, though none dared speak. The moment she placed the first rice ball down, silence rippled through the room. One by one, they reached for the food, hands shaking, not from hunger, but from disbelief. The boy from Iowa was there too, bruised but breathing. He took his rice ball, pressed it to his forehead in thanks, then broke it in half to share with the man beside him. No one spoke. The only sound was chewing. Quiet, reverent, sacred. Aiko stood in the doorway, watching them eat under the dim light, their faces softened by something the war had nearly erased: gratitude. When the last man finished, she bowed deeply. Her tears fell onto the wooden floor, vanishing into the grain. Then from the shadows, someone began to hum, the same lullaby she'd sung nights before. One by one, the others joined in, a fragile chorus rising from broken throats. For the first time, the camp didn't sound like a prison. It sounded like forgiveness. As she turned to leave, the boy whispered, "You gave us hope." Aiko smiled through her tears. "No," she said softly. "You gave it back." By dawn, she was gone. Only the rice bowls remained, and a silence that even the guards could not break. But the war wasn't over, and when it ended, everything she believed would crumble with it. When Aiko returned months later, the world she knew no longer existed. Japan had surrendered. The rising sun flag no longer flew over the island. The once feared guards now wore rags, their rifles stacked in silence. The gates of the camp stood open, but the air was heavier than ever. She walked through what remained of the compound, each step sinking into the mud where bodies had once fallen. The infirmary was empty, the cots overturned, the walls stripped bare. On one of the beds, she found a piece of cloth, torn from an American uniform, folded neatly, as if left for her. Outside, a strange sound echoed. Laughter. Not the cruel, drunken kind she remembered, but something softer. She followed it to the yard. There, beneath the same crooked flagpole, stood American soldiers, the former prisoners, distributing food to their former captors. The irony hit her like a blow. She watched one U.S. medic hand water to Captain Mori, who sat trembling on a crate, his once perfect uniform now stained and torn. He couldn't meet her eyes. For the first time, she pitied him. The Americans didn't gloat. They didn't shout. They just fed them. Quietly. Aiko stood frozen, the world spinning in silence around her. Everything she'd been taught. The sermons of honor, the purity of obedience, the glory of sacrifice. All of it dissolved in that single moment. Her hands trembled. Her chest ached. She whispered, "We fought to prove we were superior, and all it took to defeat us was kindness." A young American soldier saw her standing there and nodded. A small, wordless gesture that carried more truth than any flag. For Aiko, it wasn't victory or defeat anymore. It was revelation, and that revelation hurt more deeply than any punishment she had ever feared. But the reckoning wasn't over. Soon she would be called to testify and face the boy she thought she'd lost forever. The War Crimes Tribunal was held inside a requisitioned schoolhouse. Cracked windows, chalk dust still clinging to the blackboards, the smell of ink and mildew mixing with fear. Rows of Japanese officers sat at wooden desks, their medals stripped, their eyes hollow. Aiko was one of the few civilians called to testify. She wore the same nurse's uniform she had mended 100 times during the war. It felt heavier now, not from fabric, but from memory. Her name was read aloud. Aiko Tanaka, former nurse, Imperial POW camp. She rose, her heart hammering against her ribs. Across the room, she saw them, the American witnesses. Clean uniforms, calm faces, but behind their composure, a quiet sorrow. And among them, she saw him. The boy from Iowa, the one who had given her half a dog tag. He looked older, broader shoulders, steady eyes. But when he saw her, his breath caught. The interpreter asked if he had anything to say before the questioning began. He stood slowly, his voice soft but unshaking. "She saved us," he said. "When everyone else treated us like animals, she treated us like men." The courtroom went silent. Even the judge paused his pen. Aiko lowered her gaze, her throat tightening. The prosecutor, an American officer, turned to her. "Miss Tanaka," he asked gently, "why did you help the prisoners, knowing the risk?" She hesitated, her voice barely a whisper. "Because I remembered what it meant to be human." The officer nodded once, then said nothing more. No one else did either. For the first time in years, she didn't feel judged. She felt seen. When the session ended, the boy approached her quietly. He didn't salute, didn't speak. He just handed her a folded photograph, a snapshot of him standing in front of a farmhouse beside his mother. On the back, one line, "You kept your promise. I lived." As he walked away, Aiko's tears fell freely. Not from guilt, not from sorrow, but from the unbearable grace of forgiveness. And soon, the world would see that moment too. frozen forever in a single photograph. The flash was accidental. A young war correspondent, barely out of college, had been assigned to document the tribunal that day. He wasn't looking for stories of mercy, only evidence of justice. But when he raised his camera, he caught something else entirely. A Japanese nurse standing before an American soldier. No anger, no triumph, just quiet recognition. Between them, a single photograph exchanging hands. Her eyes glistened, his expression reverent. The click of the shutter froze that fragile instant. Forever. Days later, the image appeared on the front page of newspapers from San Francisco to London. A nurse and her enemy. Readers didn't know their names. They didn't need to. The picture said everything. That compassion could survive even the machinery of war. In Tokyo, Aiko saw it reprinted on cheap paper, hanging outside a newsstand. Passers-by stopped, stared, then moved on, unsure what to feel. Some muttered traitor. Others whispered angel. She didn't care. She just stood there, the wind tugging at her coat, staring at the ghost of her own reflection behind the glass. For a brief moment, she wondered if her country would ever understand what the camera had truly captured. Not victory, not defeat, but redemption. That evening, she received a letter stamped with a foreign postmark. It was from Iowa. Inside was a simple line, written in uneven Japanese. Kindness doesn't end when wars do. She folded it carefully, placed it beside the torn fragment of his dog tag, and exhaled a breath she felt she'd been holding for years. But history, she knew, rarely celebrated the merciful. So she disappeared from the papers, from records, from memory, until only the photograph remained. Still, that image would outlive propaganda, because truth, once seen, can't be unseen. But what came after? The silence, the healing, the life she built from ashes, was a story no camera ever caught. The years after the war passed quietly, as if the world itself had forgotten how to speak. The camps became schools, the soldiers became farmers, and the cities rebuilt themselves out of the bones of yesterday. Aiko left the island and returned to Osaka. The streets were still lined with ruins, but children's laughter echoed where air raid sirens once wailed. She rented a small room behind a burned-out temple and opened a clinic, not for soldiers, but for orphans. Japanese, Korean, American. It didn't matter. She treated them all. Her hands still trembled sometimes when she stitched wounds, but her voice never did. When the neighbors asked why she worked for no pay, she smiled faintly. Because pain has no nationality. The years turned her hair silver. The war faded into rumor. Yet every December, a single letter arrived from Iowa. No words, just a folded paper cross inside an envelope. Sometimes she placed it on her clinic altar beside a small Buddha. Sometimes she held it in her palm until the candle burned low. Once a young nurse in her clinic found the old newspaper photo, the one that had made her briefly famous. "Was this really you?" she asked, eyes wide. Aiko nodded. "Once," she said, but that woman was still learning how to forgive. At night, when the city slept, she would walk to the riverbank and listen to the water. The same rhythm that had followed her since the island, since the camp, since the first bowl of rice slid beneath that locked door. And though no one knew her name anymore, the wind seemed to. It whispered through the reeds and across the water, carrying a sound that was not sorrow but peace. The quiet heartbeat of a life that chose compassion over obedience. But her story wasn't quite over. The final chapter waited in the pages of a journal no one had yet opened. Winter came softly that year. The snow fell over Osaka like ash, covering rooftops and lanterns in a fragile calm. Inside the clinic, an old woman sat by the window, her hands folded over a worn leather journal. Her breath was shallow, her body frail, but her eyes, still, carried the quiet fire of someone who had lived through both cruelty and grace. Aiko Tanaka was 84 when her heart finally slowed. She passed without struggle, a faint smile on her lips, as if hearing a voice from long ago whisper, "Live." When the young nurse who worked beside her found the journal, she hesitated before opening it. Inside were notes written in two languages, Japanese and English. No bitterness, no judgment. Just fragments of memory. The boy from Iowa. The rice ball before dawn. Kindness is the only thing that multiplies when divided. And then near the very end, one final line written in a trembling hand. I fed the enemy, but I also fed what was left of my soul. The nurse closed the book, tears blurring the ink. Later, she placed it on the altar beside the paper crosses. 20, maybe more, all yellowed with time. News of Aiko's passing reached America months later. The soldier, now an old man himself, stood on his porch in Iowa, the winter wind tugging at his coat. He unfolded a newspaper clipping he'd kept for decades. The photograph of her, the one that had once changed how the world saw mercy. He whispered, "Arigato," and pressed the image to his heart. Somewhere beyond time, two souls, once divided by war, met again in silence. They called her a traitor once, but history remembers her as something else, a healer. If this story changed how you see war, share it with someone who still believes compassion can't survive it, because sometimes the smallest act of mercy, a bowl of rice in the dark, outlives every empire that tried to bury it.